Germany never understood what kind of country it had invaded. The assumption was that a state built on coercion and terror would shatter the moment it started losing. France had. Poland had. Yugoslavia had fallen in less than 2 weeks. The pattern was consistent. What Hitler called the rotten structure was supposed to collapse the same way. It didn't. Germany could conquer Soviet territory, it could destroy Soviet armies, it could even force Stalin out of Moscow. But to collapse the Soviet Union, Germany needed Soviet people to choose Germany over Stalin, and Nazi Germany made that impossible. And the reason it didn't has almost nothing to do with the battlefield, and almost everything to do with what the Soviet Union had spent the previous decade building, and what Germany spent the entire war failing to exploit. Subscribe if you want history that goes past the operational maps. Hitler told General Alfred Jodl, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." British and American intelligence put Soviet survival at weeks. The German operational planning staff built Barbarossa around the assumption that the Soviet regime would fracture under military pressure the way the Tsarist regime had fractured in 1917. Defeat would trigger political collapse. Political collapse would trigger a negotiated peace. The war in the East would be over before winter. By October 1941, the numbers supported every part of that analysis. Germany had captured over 3.5 million Soviet soldiers in encirclements that had no precedent in military history. The Wehrmacht had destroyed an estimated 17,000 Soviet aircraft and 20,000 tanks. Army Group Center was advancing on Moscow with its forward units close enough to see the Kremlin's spires through binoculars. The Soviet government was packing files onto trains. On October 15th, Stalin's State Defense Committee passed a top-secret evacuation order. The General Staff, the Diplomatic Corps, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, and the Council of People's Commissars were ordered to evacuate to Krivosheev, 700 miles to the east, effective immediately. By the next morning, panic consumed the capital. Commissar Lazar Kaganovich ordered the Moscow metro closed and wired for demolition, the only time in the system's history it would fail to open, before frantically reversing the order hours later as the situation stabilized. Lavrenti Beria received instructions to mine Moscow's bridges, warehouses, and factories. Stalin's personal train waited at Moscow station. A member of the Politburo later said Stalin told him on October 15th that he intended to leave. The government had 1 day to get out. If you are looking for the moment when Soviet collapse appeared closest, this is it. A Kremlin office, a Politburo meeting, a train waiting, and a city wired for demolition. Moscow falls in November 1941. The industry had been relocating since July. Over 1,000 factories dismantled, loaded onto rail cars, rebuilt in the Urals beyond any German advance. The Trans-Siberian Railway still runs, the conscription machine still feeds fresh divisions to the front, and by the time German forces are consolidating their hold on Moscow, the Red Army is still generating replacements faster than Germany can destroy them. What a captured Moscow produces is a psychological crisis, a propaganda catastrophe, and a massive logistical disruption. What it does not produce is a Politburo with a peace faction, because the NKVD spent the previous decade making sure no such faction could exist. Germany's problem was not that it conquered too little. It was that it had no idea what to do with what it conquered. German forces are now occupying Belarus, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and European Russia. That is roughly 1 million square miles of territory, containing tens of millions of people, governed by an ideology that treats the local population as subhuman resources to be consumed rather than people to be administered. Ukraine had genuine grievances against Moscow. The Holodomor famine had killed millions only a decade earlier. Parts of the Caucasus wanted independence. The Baltic states had been Soviet for barely a year and had no loyalty to Moscow. In the early weeks of Barbarossa, some populations genuinely welcomed German forces as liberators. Germany did not lose that welcome by accident. It murdered it. The Einsatzgruppen followed the army. The hunger policy killed an estimated 2 million Soviet prisoners in the first 8 months of the war. By some estimates, more than half of all Soviet soldiers captured in 1941. So what Germany actually inherits in this scenario is a fractured territory, generating constant partisan resistance, requiring hundreds of thousands of troops to police, producing far less economic output than its pre-war potential, because the people working it are either dead, enslaved, or actively sabotaging production. The Ukrainian grain that was supposed to feed Germany flows to the Reich at a fraction of its potential. The Caucasus oil that justified much of Barbarossa's southern axis remains contested or destroyed before German forces can secure it. Meanwhile, Britain is still fighting. The United States enters the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Regardless of what happens in Russia, Hitler declares war on America 4 days after Pearl Harbor, and nothing about a Soviet collapse changes that calculation. Germany has won its greatest military victory in history, and while German commanders are consolidating 3 million square miles of conquered territory, Allied bombers are hitting German industry with less resistance than at any point in the war, because the Luftwaffe that would have defended those cities is committed east. It now has to hold all of it with an exhausted army, fight a two-front war against Britain and America, manage an occupation that its own ideology has made into a permanent insurgency, and somehow extract enough economic benefit from what it has conquered. From a population it has just spent 6 months starving and shooting. But none of that answers the operational argument, the one that keeps coming up in every discussion of Barbarossa. What if Army Group Center had concentrated on Moscow from the start? The operational argument is real. If Army Group Center drives directly on Moscow in July instead of diverting south to Kiev, Moscow probably falls in September rather than stalling in December. That part is likely true. But the operational argument assumes that capturing a capital produces political breakdown. The Soviet Union was not built that way. The government had already prepared to operate from Krivosheev. The October 15th evacuation order wasn't improvised panic. It was a contingency that had been prepared months in advance. Stalin had already decided, at least momentarily, to leave. Political collapse requires something military victory alone cannot produce: a faction inside the defeated government willing to negotiate. The Soviet political apparatus had spent the previous decade eliminating every person capable of forming one. NKVD didn't just purge the military, it purged every potential negotiating counterpart within the Soviet state. There was no Kerensky available. There was no Politburo member who could approach Germany with terms without signing his own death warrant in the process. The only way to change that equation was to find the political fracture in Soviet society that military victory alone could not produce. That fracture existed. Germany found it, and then destroyed it. General Andrei Vlasov had been one of the Red Army's most capable commanders, a man who had fought the Germans around Kiev, Moscow, and Leningrad before Stalin abandoned his encircled Second Shock Army to be annihilated in the swamps of the Volkhov Front. After his capture in July 1942, Vlasov agreed to collaborate, driven by a genuine conviction that Stalin's regime was as much an enemy of the Russian people as anything Germany had to offer. His appeal resonated. Over the course of the war, roughly 1 million Soviet citizens would serve the German military in some capacity. Hewies, auxiliary police, labor battalions, many driven by despair, starvation, or genuine hatred of the Soviet regime. When Vlasov offered to unite them into a Russian liberation army against Stalin, The response from captured Soviet officers and soldiers was real. Men who believed a different Russia was possible, and that the Soviet state was worth destroying to get it. 1 million Soviet citizens willing to fight against their own government, against a Wehrmacht that launched Barbarossa with 3 million. Hitler refused to arm them. Armed Slavic formations operating in Germany's rear were politically and racially intolerable within the Nazi worldview. The Vlasov army was not given unified command, not adequately supplied, and not deployed as an effective fighting force until the spring of 1945, when the outcome was already decided. Germany had the anti-Stalin coalition it needed and dismantled it with its own ideology. The populations of Ukraine, the Baltic states, and occupied Russia contained millions of people with genuine grievances against Moscow. Germany arrived as liberators and immediately began behaving as conquerors because its ideology gave it no other option. Which means the question of whether the Soviet Union could have collapsed isn't really about Moscow or military timetables. It's about whether Germany was capable of fighting a different kind of war. The final answer is not that Germany needed one better general order. It needed to stop being Nazi Germany. And it couldn't, because the ideology that drove the war also determined how the war had to be fought. Who could be killed, who could be enslaved, who could never be trusted with a rifle regardless of how many of them wanted to use it against Stalin. The Eastern Front is usually argued as a military question. Better logistics, a different axis of advance, Moscow in September instead of December. Those arguments are real and worth having. The question is, was Soviet survival inevitable, or did Germany make it inevitable itself? Drop your answer below. Like and subscribe if this changed how you think about what Germany was actually trying to do in the East and why it failed the way it did. Thanks for watching.